So I've been rocking the 11-inch M4 iPad Pro since it launched, and I absolutely love it. But recently I started wondering if I made the right choice. So I got my hands on the 13-inch too. Let's compare. The 11-inch is a dream to hold. It's the perfect size tablet and feels like it was made for your hands. It's super thin and light, incredibly nimble and easy to maneuver, even with one hand. The 13-inch is a bit more of a handful. Literally. You definitely feel like you're holding a substantially larger device. It's like holding a MacBook screen without the bottom. For a tablet this size though, it's surprisingly thin and light. Definitely an improvement over previous generations. But compared to the 11-inch, it's definitely a lot bigger, more cumbersome to hold and noticeably heavier. Definitely a two-hander. I guess those extra 2 inches do make a difference. Now when you're at the desk or table, you obviously don't notice the difference in handling as much. You basically use the iPad while it's standing upright or laying down in front of you. The 13-inch does take up more physical space, but you'll only notice if you're in a tight spot. Especially if you're like me and you don't use the magic keyboard with your iPad. For me, it's really more of a companion device. It's great for certain things, but for others, I just use my Mac. In terms of portability, like walking around with the iPad, there's really not much difference. I mean, they're both thin and light. It doesn't feel like you're dragging around a 16-inch MacBook Pro. Something to consider though is bagability. Is that even a word? The 11-inch easily fits into a sling, bag or backpack. You won't even know it's there. The 13-inch on the other hand needs more space because of its larger footprint, so it might not be ideal for every type of bag. Next, let's take a look at the differences in screen size for a couple of different use cases. Obviously, the 13-inch can display more content, not only because it's larger, but also because of its different aspect ratio. The 11-inch has a 10:7 ratio, and the 13-inch a 4:3 ratio. This means that the 13-inch has more vertical space in landscape or more horizontal space in portrait. For casual use and web browsing, the 13-inch offers quite a bit more screen real estate, similar to what you'd get on a MacBook. Everything just has a bit more space than on the 11-inch, which sits somewhere in between a full and mobile version of the web. Interestingly, I've noticed that I use the 11-inch more often in portrait mode for handheld browsing. The 13-inch, however, feels more natural to use in landscape orientation, except maybe when reading digital newspapers or magazines. Next up, media consumption. iPads are awesome for catching up on the latest movies, binging your favorite series, and of course, YouTube. Now for this, you might think bigger is always better, right? Well, yes, but the difference isn't as dramatic as you'd expect. Because of the 4:3 aspect ratio on the 13-inch, the black bars at the top and bottom of videos are larger compared to the 11-inch model, especially with widescreen formats. Now the actual content is still larger on the 13-inch and definitely feels more immersive on that stunning OLED. Now let's talk about note-taking. I'm in quite a few meetings and calls throughout the week, so this is where the iPad really shines. I prefer writing versus typing. It just works better for my brain. Writing on the 13-inch feels really similar to an A4 or letter-sized notebook. The 11-inch feels more like those half-size notebooks, and actually that's what I've always preferred. Not sure why. However, when I'm having a brainstorm session or I'm mapping out a workflow, the 13-inch works so much better, because you don't have to constantly zoom in and out. Now let's look at some of the more creative stuff I do on my iPad. Now again, I don't view the iPad as a Mac replacement. They're two separate tools with different purposes. I do a ton of design, video editing and motion graphics work, but I never really use the iPad for those. But for things like sketching, storyboarding, drawing and lettering, the iPad is my go-to device. This is where the Apple Pencil truly shines. For these creative tasks, the 13-inch iPad Pro is a much better fit than the 11-inch model. Now don't get me wrong, you can do all of this stuff on the 11-inch, but it's just not as convenient as on the larger canvas of the 13-inch, especially when there's a lot of interface elements. And again, you won't won't be constantly zooming in and out as you might with the smaller model. The same can be said about photo editing. That's actually another thing I prefer to do on iPad rather than on Mac. There's just something magical about manipulating photos with the touchscreen and the Apple Pencil. Lightroom works great on both the 11 and 13-inch iPads, but again, the larger canvas of the 13-inch is just more pleasant to work with, and it just feels more immersive. So I haven't really talked about multitasking. When I'm working on the iPad, I typically focus on one app at a time. I do use slide over frequently for common apps like Spotify, Notes, Files, and yes, the calculator. Split screen is definitely better on the 13-inch model. The 11-inch feels a bit cramped when you've got multiple apps open. So what about Stage Manager? Well, I just don't use it. Now trust me, I've tried, but it just feels unintuitive and very limiting. I just don't get why Apple tries to reinvent the wheel instead of just making it work like on the Mac. Oh, one more thing about screen real estate. There's an option in the display menu called Display Zoom. By default, it's set to standard, but if you switch it to more space, all the interface elements and icons shrink, giving you more room to work, just like on the Mac. It's not for everyone, but I use this on the 11-inch all the time, and honestly, it makes things feel way more spacious, and kinda ties the gap with the 13-inch. Alright, it's decision time. It's not easy, because both the 11 and 13-inch iPad Pros are great devices, but hey, you'll have to choose. The 11-inch is the perfect form factor for a tablet. It's incredibly comfy to hold, easy to handle, and very portable. I definitely prefer this size for handheld use. The screen is also big enough for most tasks you typically do on an iPad. However, for some creative work and multitasking, it can feel a bit cramped. The 13-inch has a substantially larger canvas to play around with, and it's more immersive. However, you'll sacrifice some of the convenience of the smaller form factor. And if you end up pairing it with a Magic Keyboard, you're essentially in laptop territory. Ultimately, I think you need to consider what you'll use your iPad for. Are you doing a lot of creative work, or is it mainly for casual browsing and media consumption? Also, take a look at your other devices. Do you really need a big 13-inch iPad if you already have a MacBook? Does the 11-inch iPad make sense if you're already rocking an iPhone Pro Max? Food for thought. As for my decision, I'm sticking with the 11-inch iPad Pro. Ultimately, the form factor is perfect for handheld use, especially as a companion device to my Mac. Now sure, I'll miss the larger canvas of the 13-inch, but I can get everything done on the 11-inch too. It's the ideal balance of portability and functionality. Let me know in the comments if you're team 11-inch or 13-inch.